Hello, everybody, and welcome to Toujane, Tunisia, in Call of Duty 2. Call of Duty 2 from 2005. Developed by Infinity Ward, Call of Duty 2 is a game set during World War II. It has 3 campaigns: a Russian campaign, a British campaign, and an American campaign. And I believe this gun here is a Flak 88 artillery cannon, although I'm not entirely confident about that. So, we are here in the town of Toujane, Tunisia, because the British campaign in Call of Duty 2 sees you fighting in the North African front of World War II. The North African campaign is a very storied campaign in World War II. It has a veneer of honor, I think, in the popular consciousness, primarily because of the German commander Erwin Rommel, who commanded the Africa Corps. And Erwin Rommel received a sort of a respect in the historical narrative of World War II. He has generally been seen as a honorable man and a brilliant commander, sort of separated from the atrocities of Nazi Germany. The war in North Africa has often been called the one sort of fair campaign of World War II. Now, I don't know how true that is. In actuality, I know that that narrative has also been pushed back upon, kind of called a myth. And I'm not educated enough to speak on that. But the campaign here in Call of Duty 2 and the British campaign has you fighting under Bernard Montgomery. And this matchup between Montgomery and Rommel is kind of a legendary matchup. Rommel's command of his armored tank units is likewise legendary. The battle in North Africa was heavily fought by tanks. were major components on every front, but when you're talking about the North African campaign, they are a major feature. Rommel had his panzers, of course, and the British had, I believe they were called Crusader tanks. And the Crusader tanks were largely inferior to the German armor, although eventually the American-made Shermans would arrive. I think they were the Shermans. Military history and military equipment history is not my forte, but I think it was the Sherman tanks that the Americans started sending out. And that was an improvement to the British Crusaders, but Rommel's expert command of his tanks was a problem through the entirety of the North African campaign. In fact, he came to be known as the Desert Fox. The Desert Fox. Thanks to his abilities in the desert terrain of North Africa. Rommel's primary strategy, or a common tactic that he used that helped him earn his reputation, was sending his tanks on large flanking maneuvers. So they would circle wide out in the desert and then come up on the side or flanking the British forces. And this was a recurring issue, but eventually, largely due to supply line issues, or at least in part due to supply line issues, because of how the Mediterranean war had turned against the Germans. There was a constant battle for the Mediterranean due to its ability as due to its place as a supply network for not only North Africa, but Southern Europe as well. And at a certain point, the Allies had kind of locked down the Mediterranean quite well, especially from the British island of, or the British-held island of Malta. I think it was Malta. It was a major refueling and supply station for Commonwealth and Allied forces in the Mediterranean. And the Germans tried their damnedest to bring Malta down. Also, I'm talking a lot about history here and not maybe enough about the map. I like these maps here where they just disappear off in the distance. They don't even render any, dunes or hills or mountains or anything. It just hits this wall of blue nothingness. And I like these North African maps in Call of Duty 2 because this front of the war wasn't really shown in any of the other Call of Duty World War II games. So it makes it feel pretty unique to be here in Call of Duty 2. Here we are in Rostov, Russia. And these location names are the map names. It's just the place and then the country. And of course, Russia at this time is not the country, it's just a unit within the Soviet Union. And I said there was a Russian campaign in Call of Duty 2. And in that one, you play as a Russian soldier fending off the German advance into Russia. You keep them out of Moscow at first, and then I think for the rest of the campaign you're just fighting to secure Stalingrad. And we've got some blurry propaganda posters. Also, I think when it says Rostov here, I think that's meaning Rostov-on-Don, which is a city kind of in southern Russia, near the Black Sea, or I think the Sea of Azov. Is that the little sea next to the Black Sea, right? Rostov-on-Don is near there. So here's that port. So it's a port city, I guess. We can see some battleships out there from the Soviet Navy, I suppose. But we will walk around Rostov here. We've got some factory smokestacks. The snow coming down. I like the cloth wrapped around our gun. The hammer and sickle. The emblem of the Soviet Union. This doesn't seem like a good way to stack these items. The barrel just on its side, on top of that crate, and then the pallet leaning there in the middle. But yeah, the North African campaign is a very interesting one. It's kind of sort of another testament to the notion that Mussolini and Italy, as an ally of Germany, kind of maybe did more harm than good. You know, with friends like these, who needs enemies, right? Because Mussolini had visions of sort of a new Roman Empire, and so he wanted to conquer North Africa, Greece. I mean, he wanted to rule the whole Mediterranean, basically. And he tried that. He started that. Starting attacks in Africa, in Egypt, in particular, I believe. I think he first landed in Egypt. much wherever you went. The Italians were, if they met with initial successes, they were very quickly turned back and were starting to falter quite heavily. And then, of course, the Allied forces were sending in reinforcements and supplies to help the Greeks, help Britain in Egypt, for instance. What's that say? Something nouveau. Cafe. A poster with the word Panzer on it. Propaganda poster for the German Panzer divisions, I suppose. But yeah, Mussolini was on the back foot in his visions for a new Rome, and he started appealing to Hitler for help. And so Hitler decided to help him out, and he diverted German forces to the Mediterranean to help with Mussolini's boondoggles. And these would prove to be major failures in the long run that would tie up large portions of the German forces for no good reason in the end. I mean, there's a lot of writing on that poster. Who's stopping to read all that? And, I mean, certainly you can make the argument that if you won, it would have been worth it, right? But, so I'm not saying that it was necessarily an indefensible attempt, but certainly in the end it seems rather foolish because all these resources were sent away and produced very little benefit. And then once the North African campaign was concluded, once Montgomery drove Rommel into the sea, along with capturing something like 250,000 German soldiers, the stage was set at that point for an Allied invasion of Italy. All they had to do was hop up from the North African coastline. They went through Sicily, right? They went through Sicily and went into Italy from there. And of course that story, there's that famous story of Operation Mincemeat, where they tricked the Germans and the Italians into thinking that the Allied invasion was going to be through Sardinia. They dropped a corpse, I think near Spain, and it washed up on shore, and it had papers in it describing the upcoming invasion of Italy through Sardinia. And at that point, the Enigma code had been broken by the British, and so they had, free access into the German communications, which was an incredible benefit for them. And we have this sort of industrial building here with all this grating up above and the pipes emerging through it. Why is that grating up there? To help stabilize the pipes or something? Seems like it would make it hard to change the light bulbs. Some more German propaganda posters. I'm not sure if this is supposed to mean that the Germans have conquered Rostov. Well, I guess they would have, right? Because the Germans took Ukraine. They were way far east into the Soviet Union, and Rostov isn't much farther east from Ukraine, so it makes sense that, oh yeah, here's swastikas hanging on the walls and stuff. So yeah, I guess the Germans are already here. So I suppose those battleships out in the sea were German battleships. Yeah, the North African campaign, it was this kind of back and forth. The British would push west through Libya from Egypt and force the Germans back into, Tunisia or Morocco. And then the Germans would turn it around and push them east again. They were like running back and forth across the desert multiple times. And it eventually culminated in Operation Torch, which was an American force. I think the Americans were there. Yeah, they were. The Americans joined from Morocco, landing in Morocco, and the British broke out from El Alamein in Egypt, crossing the Devil's Garden, as it was called, which was the minefield covered in barbed wire and stuff. This is Newvillers, France, by the way. And, of course, we're in France because the American campaign of Call of Duty 2 sees you landing in France on D-Day and taking part in the early battles of Operation Overlord. But yeah, Operation Torch. The Americans and the British pincered the German forces, trapping them in Tunisia. And it was another one of Hitler's great military blunders. Obviously, Adolf Hitler there are a number of instances where he went against the advice of his generals and made military decisions that proved to be disastrous blunders. And one of them was his insistence on fighting in North Africa. Erwin Rommel actually went back to Germany and begged Hitler to pull the German forces out of North Africa and cede the territory to the Allies. But Hitler refused, and the end result was that something like 250,000 German troops were taken prisoner in Tunisia. But yeah, that was a very critical point in World War II, was who would control North Africa. Because if the Germans held it, then it would put the whole Mediterranean in danger, make it very hard for the British holdings. And it would have made it impossible for the Allies to launch their Italian invasion that they did. Oh, because that came up through North Africa. And one of the interesting things about Operation Torch that I don't know how many people know about or think about is that when the Americans landed, also I think it was a joint American and British operation, so when I have been talking about the Americans landing in Morocco, there were also British soldiers there as well, I believe. But when they landed, they were fighting the French. Yeah, I don't know if this is common knowledge. I'm speaking from an American perspective, and in my education, it was not something that we covered. But also, if you're listening from around the world, maybe, I know that the American education system is not necessarily viewed as one of the greatest in terms of world history. But anyway, of course, when the Nazis invaded France, they set up the puppet government called the Vichy government, which was run by Philippe Pétain. And the Vichy French ended up fighting for the Nazis in various engagements. So, for instance, in North Africa, it was Vichy armies that were repelling the American advances, the American and British advances from Northwest Africa. Now, eventually, most of these French units would turn to the Allied side and join the Free French Army, which was headed up by Charles de Gaulle, who is, of course, one of the most famous Frenchmen of the past numerous centuries. Charles de Gaulle led the French government in exile and commanded the French Liberation Army that was trying to retake France. And, of course, the French were in North Africa at the time because back in the 30s and the 40s, this was a time of colonialism, right? Colonialism was the law of the land at that time. If you were a powerful nation from the 16, 17, 18, 1900s, you had to have colonies. And so, this was part of why the fight over North Africa was also so important, was because you were also fighting for control of the colonies, which were very lucrative and also strategically important. But yeah, France had colonies in North Africa, and so the Vichy French government manned those colonies after the German invasion. So here we have a cathedral with beautiful blue stained glass. I really love the the stained glass in here and how it looks from inside. Yeah, it's very interesting thinking about those collaborators from World War II, like Philippe Pétain. And of course, there's even a term for it. You can call somebody a quisling to call them a collaborator. And that comes from the collaborationist government of, was it Finland or Sweden? I forget, it was one of the Nordic countries or somebody in that area. They were led by a man named Quisling. The puppet government was, or the collaborationist government. And so if you want to call somebody a collaborationist now, you can call them a Quisling. Here we are in Moscow, Russia. Of course, in World War II, despite the German army's efforts, Moscow was never conquered. The Red Army defended it successfully and turned the tide against the Germans, pushing them all the way back through the Soviet Union. And did I say Russian? I might have. Obviously, it was the Soviet Union at the time. But anyway. Yeah, they pushed them all the way back. Pushed them through Poland, and eventually the Red Army marched into Berlin. So, Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, even though he failed in North Africa to defeat the Allies, he would eventually move on to help oversee preparations for the Allied landings in Normandy. He fought for stronger coastal defenses to repel the Allies. But there was disagreement on that topic, and Hitler, as usual, was not a very helpful military leader. So, in Rommel's estimation, by the time the Allies landed, the fortifications on the French coastline were not nearly as secure as they should have been, which was obviously a good thing for Operation Overlord and the Allied invasion of Western Europe. We have some graffiti here. Einer spinnt immer. What does that mean? I hope that's not like... I hope that's not horribly offensive or something, and I just said the worst thing ever invented by man. But yeah, Moscow here. Obviously, the Eastern Front is infamous for the absolute horror show that it was fighting there. Not that any front line is pleasant, of course, but the stories of the Eastern Campaign are particularly grim. This is not a place that you would want to be, especially if you were in the Red Army. So, Call of Duty 2 is, you feel its age. You can't sprint, for instance, which feels very funny in a Call of Duty game. It gives you like phantom limb syndrome or something when I'm playing this, when I'm playing the campaign. I'm constantly having this sensation of, oh, I should sprint forward, I should sprint over to that cover, I should sprint. And of course, you can't, so it does feel a bit weird dealing with that. But in many ways, it just feels like Call of Duty. The games have become smoother and refined, and there's, kill streaks and perks and stuff like that, but at the end of the day, it's a fast-paced shooter with low time to kill, set in a, modern or historical or sometimes slightly futuristic military setting. And that is Call of Duty, So, even though this game came out in 2005, it really does feel of a lineage of the modern Call of Duty games. And here we are in Vossenack, Germany. Vossenack, Germany. We've got some gorgeous rolling green hills stretching off into the horizon. Trees and a barn here. Some farmland here in Germany. But of course, the signs of war are here as well. Barricades block the roads. And this sort of depression in the landscape has been, is the site of a bunker. The site of a bunker. So we will go check out that bunker in a minute. We can't go into this farmhouse, so we'll just admire it from a distance. And isn't that, this would be such a beautiful spot if it weren't obviously marred by a warfare. We have a sewer grate there blocking our entrance into that drainage system, or maybe it's just a tunnel to allow a brook to pass through or something. The campaign of Call of Duty 2 is quite enjoyable. It's very simple, the missions are very short, and have very simple objectives, hold off the German advance, or capture this farmhouse, or, this or that. But it's enjoyable in its simplicity. Here we have a door, a steel its hinges from over there, presumably. And something kind of funny about these old games, Call of Duty 1 and 2, is that they have Captain Price, the character Captain Price. And in Call of Duty Modern Warfare, Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare, Infinity Ward would bring back Captain Price, or, sort of his character model or something, as John Price, who is a major character in CoD 4, and has been a major character in all of the Modern Warfare games, including the reboot series. And in this game, he has his iconic mustache, and he wears a red beret. And at the end of the game, while the credits are rolling, there's actually a cutscene that plays, this very intricate cutscene that shows a squad of American soldiers infiltrating a German base and rescuing Captain Price. So, Infinity Ward clearly had a soft spot for Captain Price back in 2005. So, it's just kind of a fun Easter egg. I mean, it's obviously not the same character directly, because the timelines don't match up, but I don't think it's meant to be taken too seriously. I think it's just a fun reference more than anything else. So, if you're a fan of the Modern Warfare series, and you've never played Call of Duty 1 or 2, you might be interested to check them out and see your old buddy Captain Price in a very different environment, decades before the events of Call of Duty 4. Here we have another road and an overturned truck spilling its cargo on the dirt roadside. And a bunker here with a window for shooting out of. And a hole in the ceiling with a ladder if you want to pop out and get a good view of the surroundings. So, I think we've seen all there is to see on this map. But I noticed in the bunker there was a bed. A little bed. So, let's head in there and let our character take a little rest before we go on and explore the other maps that we have in store today. I believe it was down here. Yep. A little bed. Alright, we can't go prone on it, but that's alright. We'll just take a seat and relax. Welcome to Matmata, Tunisia. So, as I was explaining earlier, the North African campaign took place all along the north coast. Morocco, Libya, Egypt, but it concluded in Tunisia, where the Allied forces trapped the Germans in a pincer maneuver. The British from the east, and the Americans and the British from the west. And I think by that point, actually, the French, the Vichy French had turned sides, surrendered to the Allies, and they might have been fighting for them at that point. I'm not confident on that. So here we have a lovely evening glow over this town, over this little village of Matmata. The sand dunes off in the horizon, the palm trees emerging from the sand. And there's just enough light to still see where we're going in town. It's not totally night yet. We can walk past tanks and jeeps and trucks and little market stalls and crates of German supplies. And admire the lovely architecture of the area. I've always wondered what those little wooden posts sticking out of the tops of the building walls are. You see them on some of the buildings, but not others. And I feel that they're a sort of iconic piece of the architecture of this region of the world. That you see them in movies and photos and stuff. Those little wooden posts right there. I'm just curious what those are. Are they for attaching stuff to? I mean, do you put awnings on them or something? They seem to. I don't know, that doesn't seem, that seems like overkill for something like that. Curious. I'm just curious. If any of you have an answer to that, I would love to know. And we've got the domed roofs associated with Arab Muslim architecture. I think at this point in history, the sort of native Berber, or I don't know enough about African history to say if they were quote-unquote native or not, but I believe the culture of this area in North Africa was predominantly the Berber people. And the Arab world conquered much of this region and ended up spreading its influence here. So you ended up with a much more think this is like a well of some kind. I have no idea. I don't know how it functions, but seems like a little well or, some kind of a fountain or something. How it has that wide basin. And let's climb up here. We have a nice view of the town from its accessible rooftop positions. And I think we can wrap up here and head off to another map. Head off to another map. Another map. Another map. Another map. And here we are in Burgundy, France, looking at a half-track vehicle covered in foliage camouflage, tree branches and such attached to the vehicle to provide it a modicum of camouflage. And this is a half-track vehicle because you can see it has a sort of tread locomotion device on its back half, and it has wheels on its front half. And many of these maps are taken from campaign missions, so they're sort of, they take a mission from the campaign, and they might wall off certain areas, or make certain areas of it inaccessible, and then use the rest as a multiplayer map. And that was a much more common thing to do in the old days of multiplayer map development. If a game had a campaign mode, they would often use campaign levels as the building blocks or starting point for multiplayer maps. Nowadays, multiplayer maps are usually just completely drawn from an independent design process, separate from the campaign development. And I'm sure that's not universally true, but that's generally the case nowadays. And we have I'm not actually sure if this is from the campaign or not. If this level is directly from the campaign. If it is, it would most likely be from the American campaign. Because as I said, that one covers the landings at Normandy. And this tank has the foliage camouflage on it as well, but it's on fire. That's a nice, I like how they created a separate model for the camouflaged tank with burnt foliage. And we have the road stretching off into the distance. veering off around a corner. And those French hedges and bushes make it impossible for us to see any farther. And you can walk down here behind this destroyed building, find a little wooden shed. A little wooden shed. A tree with a large knot in it. And let's go into this palmed building. Take a look inside. And we have a nice view of Burgundy from up here on the second floor, along with a machine gun nest. And I think that's a good place to end our exploration of Burgundy. So let's move on and do one more map. What do you say? Alright. Nice. So here we are in Alamein, Egypt. Alamein, Egypt. In a barracks bunker. So Alamein was a pivotal area in the North African campaign. It was where the British set up their defensive line when they were pushed back by Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps. And there were two major battles at El Alamein, the second of which saw the British break through the Devil's Garden that I spoke of earlier, and put Rommel's forces on the back foot and force them into a retreat all the way back across Libya. And the reason that the British set up their line here was, as I said earlier, Rommel had a tactical maneuver that he would very often use against the British, which was he would send his tanks on a large arc to flank the enemy lines. So he would send them way out into the desert and circle around the enemy. Well, the British, once they fortified here, their defensive line stretched from the Mediterranean Sea on the north to a geographic zone to the south, and I can't remember the name of this geographic feature, but it was some kind of old seabed or something, and the cliffs and the salt flats and all this stuff that was there made it impassable for tanks. And so you can see what Montgomery did by setting up his line here. He prevented Rommel from using his favored tactic. Rommel couldn't flank to the north because of the Mediterranean, and he couldn't flank to the south because of this geographic impassable terrain. And so it forced the two armies into a head-to-head battle, which was more favorable to the British. And British had multiple commanders over the course of the North African campaign, so pardon me if it wasn't actually Montgomery that set up this line. Montgomery is the most famous one because he was the one that actually, oversaw the defeat of Rommel. But there were previous commanders before him that Churchill replaced due to their lack of success against Rommel and the Africa Corps. But anyway, I think this is a nice place to wrap up our exploration. El Alamein. This map is set during the nighttime, so it's nice and peaceful and sleepy and cozy. So I think that's a great place to leave it. So my friends, thank you for joining me for this exploration of Call of Duty 2's maps. I rambled, to be honest, pretty much the whole time, and wasn't really commenting on the maps very much, so I apologize for that if you like that more. To be honest, once I started, I realized that the maps, they reuse a lot of assets and stuff, and there's not a ton of details that you can really zoom in on without it being very blurry. So I found that there wasn't much that I was inspired to talk about. But I hope you didn't mind me rambling about the history a little more this time. And until next time, my friend, please be well, and I will too. And I'll see you next Friday for whatever our next video is. Goodbye. Goodbye.